The morning sun cast long shadows across Arlington National Cemetery as hundreds of people gathered for what would become one of the most important military funerals of the year. The air was crisp and cold, typical for late October, and the fallen. Leaves crunched softly under the feet of the arriving mourners. This wasn't just any funeral. This was the final farewell to General William Patterson, a man who had served his country for over 4 decades and earned respect from soldiers and civilians alike. Cars lined the cemetery roads as far as the eye could see. Black sedans with government license plates, military vehicles with flags flying, and family cars driven by relatives who had traveled from across the country. Everyone seemed to know exactly where they were going and what was expected of them. The ceremony had been planned for months, with every detail carefully arranged to honor a man who had given his life to serving others. The cemetery itself looked like something from a movie. Row after row of white headstones stretched across perfectly maintained grass, each one marking the final resting place of someone who had served their country. American flags fluttered in the gentle breeze, and the sound of military boots on pavement created a rhythm that felt both solemn and powerful. This was a place where heroes came to rest, and today, another hero would join their ranks. Among all the impressive uniforms and formal black clothing, one figure stood out, though not in the way you might expect. An elderly man walked slowly through the crowd, taking careful steps on the uneven ground. His name was Samuel, and at 78 years old, every movement required thought and care. His dark skin showed the lines and marks of someone who had lived through decades of both struggle and triumph. His hands, weathered from years of work, gripped a simple wooden walking stick that had seen better days. Samuel wore his best suit, the same one he had worn to church every Sunday for the past 15 years. It was clean and pressed, but anyone could see it wasn't expensive. The fabric had begun to show its age, and the style was from a different era. His shoes were polished but worn, the kind that get resoled multiple times because buying new ones isn't always an option. Despite his modest appearance, there was something about the way Samuel carried himself that spoke of dignity and pride. As he walked toward the seating area, Samuel's mind drifted back to another time, another place. He thought about a young soldier he had known many years ago, a soldier who was now the reason for this gathering. The memories were as clear as if they had happened yesterday, even though decades had passed. Some memories never fade, especially the ones that change everything. The seating arrangement at the funeral was carefully organized, just like everything else about the ceremony. The front rows were reserved for family members and the most distinguished guests. Behind them sat high-ranking military officers, government officials, and other important figures. Further back were the seats for fellow veterans, friends, and colleagues. It was a system that made sense to the organizers, a way to show respect based on rank and relationship. Samuel approached the area where the most honored guests were seated. He had every right to be there, though he knew his appearance might raise questions. This had happened before in his life, many times, and he had learned to handle such situations with patience and grace. He understood that people often made quick judgments based on what they saw, and what they saw when they looked at him was an elderly man in an old suit who didn't seem to belong among the powerful and wealthy. A young military officer, probably in his mid-20s, noticed Samuel approaching the VIP seating area. The officer was responsible for ensuring that only authorized guests sat in the designated sections, and he took his job seriously. He had been briefed on the guest list and protocol, and in his mind, everything needed to go perfectly for this important ceremony. The officer stepped forward with the confidence of youth and authority. His uniform was crisp and new, his posture perfect, and his voice carried the tone of someone used to being obeyed. He approached Samuel with what he probably thought was appropriate courtesy, though there was an underlying assumption in his manner that was impossible to miss. "Excuse me, sir," the officer said, his voice polite but firm. "I think you might be looking for the general seating area. This section is reserved for family and distinguished guests only." Samuel stopped and looked at the young man with patient eyes. He had dealt with this kind of situation countless times over the years, and experience had taught him that getting angry or defensive rarely helped. Instead, He spoke quietly and respectfully, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had learned to choose his words carefully. "I believe I'm in the right place, son," Samuel replied gently. "I have business being here today." The officer looked uncertain for a moment. Samuel's calm response wasn't what he had expected. Most people who were in the wrong place would either argue loudly or quickly apologize and move away. Samuel's quiet confidence suggested there might be more to the situation than appeared on the surface, but training and protocol won out over instinct. The officer had been taught to follow procedures, and the procedure was clear: only authorized guests in the VIP section. He looked at Samuel's modest clothing and humble appearance and made the decision that seemed obvious to him at the time. "Sir, I'm going to need to see some identification and confirmation of your invitation to sit in this area," the officer said, his tone becoming more official. "The front sections are for immediate family and high-ranking officials only." Other people in the crowd began to notice the conversation. Some turned to watch with curious expressions, while others whispered quietly to their companions. A few shook their heads with what appeared to be disapproval, though whether they disapproved of Samuel's presence or the officer's treatment of him wasn't entirely clear. Samuel reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his wallet, a worn, leather piece that had been with him for many years. His movements were slow and deliberate, partly because of his age and partly because he was thinking carefully about how to handle the situation. He knew that what happened next could either resolve the matter quickly or make it much worse. As he searched through his wallet for identification, Samuel couldn't help but think about how different this moment was from what he had expected when he woke up that morning. He had prepared himself mentally for the emotional difficulty of saying goodbye to someone who had meant so much to him. He hadn't prepared for having to prove his right to be there. The officer waited with growing impatience as Samuel slowly went through his wallet. To the young man, this delay seemed like confirmation that Samuel was stalling because he didn't belong there. The idea that Samuel might be moving slowly simply because he was elderly and careful didn't occur to the officer, who was focused on maintaining order and following his instructions. "Sir, if you don't have proper authorization, I'm going to have to ask you to move to the general seating area," the officer said, his voice getting firmer. "We need to keep this area clear for the people who are supposed to be here." Samuel looked up from his wallet and met the officer's eyes. For just a moment, there was a flash of something deeper in Samuel's expression, a hint of the strength and determination that had carried him through much more difficult situations than this one. But he kept his voice calm and steady. "Son, I understand you're doing your job," Samuel said quietly. "But I promise you I have every right to be here today. More right than most, if truth be told." The certainty in Samuel's voice gave the officer pause, but by now, other officials had noticed the commotion. A security guard approached, drawn by the crowd that was beginning to form around the conversation. The guard was older than the military officer and had years of experience dealing with people who tried to get into places they didn't belong. "What's the problem here?" the security guard asked, his tone professional but clearly supportive of the officer's position. "This gentleman is trying to sit in the VIP section without proper authorization," the officer explained. "I've asked for identification, but he hasn't been able to provide confirmation that he belongs here." The security guard looked Samuel up and down, taking in his appearance and making his own quick assessment. Like the officer, he saw an elderly man in modest clothing who didn't fit the expected profile of someone who would be in the VIP section at such an important funeral. "Sir, you'll need to move to the general seating area," the guard said with the authority of someone who had handled similar situations many times before. "This section is for invited guests only." Samuel felt the weight of the moment settling on his shoulders. He was surrounded by people who had made assumptions about him based on his appearance, and those assumptions were creating a barrier between him and the place where he belonged. The irony wasn't lost on him. Here he was being turned away from honoring a man who owed him more than anyone in that crowd would ever know. But Samuel had faced worse situations than this with grace and dignity, and he wasn't about to let this moment define him or diminish the respect he owed to the man they were there to honor. He straightened his shoulders and prepared to explain once more why he belonged exactly where he was standing. The crowd around them continued to grow as more people noticed the disturbance. Some watched with curiosity, others with discomfort. at seeing an elderly man being questioned so publicly. A few seemed annoyed that anything was disrupting the solemn atmosphere of the ceremony. But none of them stepped forward to help or ask questions about what was really happening. As the situation continued to unfold, Samuel remained calm and dignified, even as the pressure mounted around him. He knew that sometimes the most powerful response to injustice is simply to maintain your dignity and wait for the truth to emerge. He had learned this lesson many times throughout his long life, and today would be no different. The morning sun continued to shine down on Arlington National Cemetery, casting its light on a scene that was about to reveal truths that would surprise everyone present and transform what had started as a moment of assumption and prejudice into something much more profound and meaningful. The security guard crossed his arms and looked down at Samuel with the kind of expression that said the conversation was over. He had dealt with situations like this before, or at least he thought he had. In his mind, this was simple. An elderly man had wandered into the wrong section of a high-profile funeral, and it was his job to fix the problem quickly and quietly. "Sir, I'm not going to ask again," the guard said, his voice getting harder. "You need to move to the back section right now, or I'll have to escort you there myself." Samuel felt his heart beating a little faster, but his face remained calm. He had been in much more dangerous situations than this, facing much worse treatment, and he had always found a way through with his dignity and tact. This moment reminded him of other times in his life when people had looked at him and decided what he was worth based on nothing more than the color of his skin and the clothes on his back. "I understand you're trying to do your job," Samuel said, his voice still quiet but with a strength that made a few people in the growing crowd lean in to listen. "But I'm telling you, I belong here. I knew General Patterson personally. We served together." The military officer who had first approached Samuel let out a small laugh that wasn't meant to be kind. "Sir, with all due respect, General Patterson served with the highest levels of military leadership. He commanded divisions and worked with generals and colonels. I think you might be confused about your connection to him." The assumption behind those words hit Samuel like a physical blow, though he didn't let it show on his face. The young officer was essentially saying that someone like Samuel, someone old and poor and black, couldn't possibly have had a meaningful relationship with someone as important as General Patterson. It was the kind of thinking that Samuel had encountered his entire life, but it never stopped hurting. "Son," Samuel said, looking directly at the officer, "you don't know anything about me or what I've done. You're making judgments based on what you see, but what you see isn't the whole story." By now, at least 30 people had gathered around to watch what was happening. Some stood close enough to hear every word, while others hung back but kept glancing over with curious expressions. The crowd included other elderly veterans, some in wheelchairs, some using walking sticks like Samuel. A few of them looked uncomfortable with what they were seeing, but none of them spoke up. The security guard was getting more frustrated by the minute. In his experience, people who didn't belong somewhere usually gave up and left when confronted. Samuel's calm refusal to back down was making the guard's job harder, and he didn't like complications. He also didn't like the growing crowd, which was drawing attention away from the ceremony preparations. "Look, old man," the guard said, his tone getting rougher. "I don't care what stories you want to tell. This is a military funeral with strict security. You either have proper authorization to be in the VIP section or you don't. And looking at you, it's pretty clear which one it is." A few people in the crowd shifted uncomfortably at the guard's tone. One elderly woman whispered something to her husband, who shook his head and looked away. A younger man in a military dress uniform started to step forward but then stopped, apparently deciding not to get involved. Samuel felt the familiar weight of being judged and found wanting by people who knew nothing about him. It was a feeling he had carried since childhood, growing up in a time and place where the color of his skin determined how people treated him before he even opened his mouth. He had hoped that things would be different by now, that in 2023 at a place like Arlington National Cemetery, people would look deeper than surface appearances. "I'm not telling stories," Samuel said, his voice getting a little stronger. "I'm telling the truth. General Patterson and I served together in Vietnam. We were in the same unit for 8 months in 1968. I knew him when he was just Lieutenant Patterson, before he became the man you're here to honor today." The military officer shook his head with the kind of patience you show to someone who is clearly confused. "Sir, Lieutenant Patterson served with an elite unit. He was with some of the most decorated soldiers in the Army. I think you might be mixing him up with someone else you served with." The implication was clear. Someone like Samuel couldn't have served alongside someone destined for greatness like General Patterson. The assumption was that elite units were made up of a certain type of person, and Samuel didn't fit that image in their minds. Samuel reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out something that made a few people in the crowd lean forward with curiosity. It was an old photograph, creased and faded from years of being carried in his wallet. The edges were worn soft from handling, and the colors had faded to the sepia tones of old memories. "This is Lieutenant Patterson and me in Q-Chi in 1968, Samuel said, holding the photograph up so the officer and guard could see it. "We're standing next to our base camp after a mission that almost got us both killed." The security guard barely glanced at the photograph before waving his hand dismissively. "Anyone can carry around old photos, sir. That doesn't prove anything about who you are or what your relationship was to the general." The officer looked at the photo for a moment longer but then shrugged. "Sir, even if this is you in the photo, that doesn't automatically give you access to the VIP section. There are protocols and procedures for these events. If you were meant to be here as an honored guest, you would have received a formal invitation and proper credentials." Samuel carefully put the photograph back in his wallet, his movements slow and deliberate. He was thinking about how to make these men understand, how to break through the wall of assumptions they had built around him. But every word he spoke seemed to bounce off their certainty that they knew who he was and what he was worth. "I did receive an invitation," Samuel said quietly. "It came directly from the Patterson family. They specifically asked me to sit with the family section because of what their father meant to me and what I meant to him." The guard let out an impatient sigh. "Sir, if that were true, your name would be on our list and you would have received proper credentials. The fact that you don't have any paperwork tells us everything we need to know." Samuel reached into his other pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was clearly an official invitation, printed on heavy paper with the military seal at the top. He unfolded it carefully and held it out for the men to see. The officer took the invitation and looked it over quickly. For a moment his expression changed slightly, as if he was seeing something that didn't match his expectations. But then he looked back at Samuel and shook his head. "This could be for anyone," the officer said, though his voice had lost some of its earlier certainty. "And even if it is legitimate, you still need proper identification to prove you're the person named on the invitation." "I showed you my driver's license," Samuel reminded him. "My name, my address, everything matches. What's on that invitation?" The security guard stepped closer and his presence felt more threatening now. "Look, we've wasted enough time on this. Whether you have an invitation or not, you're causing a disturbance. The ceremony is about to begin and we need to clear this up right now." The crowd around them had grown even larger, and people were starting to look at their watches and murmur about the delay. Some seemed annoyed that anything was interrupting the solemn atmosphere of the funeral. Others looked uncomfortable with what they were witnessing but weren't sure what to do about it. Samuel looked around at all the faces staring at him. Some showed curiosity, others showed impatience or annoyance. A few showed what might have been sympathy, but not enough to make anyone step forward and speak up on his behalf. He was surrounded by people, but he felt completely alone. "Son," Samuel said to the security guard, his voice carrying decades of patience and dignity, "I fought for this country. I bled for this country. I earned the right to be here today, not just because I have an invitation, but because of what I gave and what I sacrificed. The man we're here to honor today knows exactly who I am and what I did for him." The guard's face hardened at what he saw as defiance. "I don't care what you think you did or didn't do. My job is to maintain order and security at this event, and right now, you're disrupting both. Either you move to the general seating area voluntarily, or I'll escort you there myself." Samuel felt the moment reaching a tipping point. He could see in the guard's eyes that the man had made up his mind and wasn't going to be swayed by words or evidence. The officer was nodding in agreement, clearly ready to support whatever action the guard decided to take. The elderly man straightened his shoulders and lifted his chin slightly. He had faced down enemy soldiers in Vietnam, had stared death in the face more than once, and had survived decades of prejudice and discrimination. He wasn't about to be intimidated by two men who had already decided who he was without bothering to learn the truth. "If you're going to move me," Samuel said quietly, "you'll have to do it by force, because I'm not leaving voluntarily. I have every right to be here, and I'm going to exercise that right." The security guard's hand moved toward Samuel's arm, and several people in the crowd took a step back. The moment felt like it was about to explode into something ugly and embarrassing for everyone involved. Just as the guard's fingers were about to close around Samuel's elbow, a new voice cut through the tension like a knife through butter. "What exactly is going on here?" The voice that cut through the tension was deep and commanding, carrying the kind of authority that made everyone within hearing distance immediately straighten their posture. It belonged to a man who was clearly used to being listened to and obeyed without question. The security guard's hand froze just inches from Samuel's arm, and both he and the young officer turned toward the source of the voice with expressions that mixed surprise and instant respect. Standing behind them was a man who commanded attention, without even trying. He was tall and broad-shouldered, probably in his early 60s, with silver-gray hair that was perfectly styled despite the morning breeze. His military uniform was immaculate, covered with ribbons and medals that told the story of a lifetime of distinguished service. But it was the 4 stars on his shoulders that made everyone in the crowd immediately understand that this was someone very important. General Robert Hayes had served his country for over 40 years, rising through the ranks from a young lieutenant to one of the most respected military leaders in America. He had commanded troops in multiple conflicts, advised presidents, and earned the respect of soldiers and civilians alike. When he spoke, people listened, and when he gave an order, it was followed without question. The security guard immediately stepped back from Samuel, his hand dropping to his side as he snapped to attention. "Sir, we were just handling a security situation. This gentleman doesn't appear to have proper authorization to sit in the VIP section." General Hayes looked at the scene in front of him with the sharp eyes of someone who had spent decades assessing situations quickly and accurately. He saw an elderly man standing with quiet dignity, despite being surrounded by people who were clearly treating him as a problem to be solved. He saw a crowd of onlookers who seemed more interested in the drama than in understanding what was really happening. And he saw 2 officials who appeared to have already made up their minds about who was right and who was wrong. "I see," the general said, his tone neutral but carrying an undertone that suggested he was not pleased with what he was witnessing. "And what exactly makes you think this gentleman doesn't belong here?" The security guard glanced at the military officer, looking for support. The officer stepped forward, clearly more comfortable addressing someone of the general's rank than the guard was. "Sir, this man claims to have served with General Patterson, but he doesn't have proper credentials for the VIP section. He has what appears to be an invitation, but anyone could have something like that. We're just following protocol to ensure the security and dignity of the ceremony." General Hayes turned his attention to Samuel, and for the first time since the confrontation, began. Someone was looking at him with genuine interest rather than suspicion. The general's expression was serious but not unkind, and when he spoke, his voice carried respect that had been missing from every other interaction Samuel had experienced that morning. "What's your name, sir?" the general asked. "Samuel Washington," Samuel replied, his voice steady despite everything he had just been through. "I served in the Army from 1966 to 1970, mostly in Vietnam." The general nodded, processing this information. "And you say you served with General Patterson?" "Yes, sir. We were in the same unit for 8 months in 1968. He was Lieutenant Patterson then, and I was Sergeant Washington. We served together in some of the heaviest fighting of the war." General Hayes studied Samuel's face carefully, looking for something that the other officials had missed. There was something about the way Samuel carried himself, despite his age and modest appearance, that spoke of military bearing. The way he stood at attention when addressing a superior officer, the way he answered questions directly and without elaboration, the quiet confidence in his voice when he spoke about his service. "What unit were you with, Sergeant Washington?" the general asked, using Samuel's military rank in a way that immediately acknowledged his service. "1st Battalion, 503rd Infantry Regiment, 173rd Airborne Brigade," Samuel answered without hesitation. "We were stationed at Firebase Charlie for most of our deployment." The general's expression changed subtly. Those weren't just random names that someone could have looked up. The 173rd Airborne was one of the most decorated units of the Vietnam War, and Firebase Charlie had been the site of some of the most intense fighting of the entire conflict. Anyone who could name those specifics with such certainty had almost certainly been there. "Tell me about Lieutenant Patterson," General Hayes said, his voice taking on a different quality now, more like someone conducting an interview than someone questioning a potential security threat. Samuel's eyes grew distant for a moment, as if he was looking back across the decades to a time and place that felt both very far away and very immediate. "He was a good officer, sir. Young, maybe 24 or 25, but he cared about his men. He didn't ask us to do anything he wouldn't do himself. He led from the front always." The crowd around them had grown quiet, sensing that something important was happening. Even the security guard and the military officer seemed to realize that this conversation was taking a different direction than they had expected. "Go on," General Hayes encouraged. "There was a mission in November of 1968, Samuel continued, his voice taking on the measured tone of someone telling a story that had been burned into his memory. "We were supposed to secure a village that intelligence said was being used as a supply depot by the North Vietnamese. But when we got there, it was a trap. They were waiting for us." Samuel paused, and the general waited patiently for him to continue. "Some memories took time to put into words, especially the difficult ones. The fighting was intense, sir. We took casualties almost immediately. Lieutenant Patterson was hit in the first few minutes, shrapnel from a rocket-propelled grenade. He was bleeding badly, couldn't walk on his own. The rest of the unit was pinned down by sniper fire." The general leaned forward slightly, completely focused on Samuel's words. "What happened next?" "Someone had to get the lieutenant to safety, sir. He was losing a lot of blood, and the medic couldn't reach him where he was. So I went after him." Samuel's voice remained steady, but there was an undercurrent of emotion that hadn't been there before. "I crawled through about 50 yards of open ground while they were shooting at anything that moved. Took me nearly 20 minutes to reach him. Then I had to carry him back the same way." The general was silent for a long moment, processing what he had just heard. Around them, the crowd had grown completely quiet. Even the security guard and the officer were listening intently, beginning to realize that they might have made a serious mistake. "Sergeant Washington," General Hayes said finally, his voice carrying a weight that made everyone present understand that something significant was happening. "Are you telling me that you carried Lieutenant Patterson to safety under enemy fire?" "Yes, sir. He was unconscious by the time I got him back to our lines. The medic said he would have died if we hadn't gotten him out of there when we did." The general stared at Samuel for a long moment, and then something seemed to click in his mind. His expression changed dramatically, shifting from professional interest to something approaching awe. "Sergeant Samuel Washington," he said slowly, as if testing the name. "The Medal of Honor recipient from the 173rd Airborne?" Samuel nodded quietly. "Yes, sir." The effect of those words on the crowd was immediate and dramatic. The Medal of Honor is the highest military decoration awarded by the United States, given only to those who have displayed extraordinary courage in combat. There are fewer than 3,500 living recipients, making it one of the rarest honors in America. The security guard's face went pale as he realized what had just been revealed. The military officer looked like he wanted to disappear into the ground. Around them, people began whispering to each other as the significance of the moment sank in. General Hayes stepped forward and extended his hand to Samuel. "Sergeant Washington, it is an honor to meet you. Your actions that day didn't just save Lieutenant Patterson's life. They allowed him to continue serving his country for 40 more years and to touch the lives of thousands of soldiers who served under his command." Samuel shook the general's hand, his weathered fingers meeting the firm grip of the younger man. He was worth saving, sir. He proved that every day for the rest of his career. The general turned to address the security guard and the military officer, his voice taking on a tone that made it clear he was not pleased with what had transpired. Gentlemen, this man is not just authorized to sit in the VIP section. He should be sitting in the front row as an honored guest of the highest order. Sergeant Washington didn't just serve with General Patterson, he saved his life and earned the Medal of Honor doing it. The officer looked mortified. Sir, we had no way of knowing. You had every way of knowing, General Hayes interrupted, his voice sharp. You could have listened to what he was telling you instead of making assumptions based on his appearance. You could have treated him with the respect that any veteran deserves, regardless of how they're dressed or what they look like. The general turned back to Samuel, his expression softening. Sergeant Washington, on behalf of everyone here, I apologize for how you've been treated. Would you allow me to escort you to your proper place of honor? Samuel nodded, his dignity intact despite everything he had endured. That would be fine, sir. As General Hayes offered his arm to Samuel and began walking toward the front of the seating area, the crowd parted respectfully. Word of what had happened was already spreading through the gathering, and people who had been watching the confrontation with curiosity or annoyance now looked at Samuel with the respect he had earned long ago. The morning sun continued to shine down on Arlington National Cemetery, but now it seemed to be illuminating something beautiful rather than something troubling. Justice had been served, truth had been revealed, and a hero had finally received the recognition he deserved. As General Hayes walked arm in arm with Samuel toward the front of the ceremony, something beautiful began to happen. People who had been standing around watching the confrontation now stepped aside with genuine respect. Men who had been checking their watches impatiently moments before now stood at attention as the Medal of Honor recipient passed by. Women who had been whispering about the delay now fell silent in recognition of what they were witnessing. The transformation was remarkable to watch. The same crowd that had allowed an elderly hero to be questioned and humiliated now understood the magnitude of their mistake. It was as if a veil had been lifted, revealing the truth that had been there all along. Samuel hadn't changed at all, but everything about how people saw him was completely different. General Hayes guided Samuel to the front row, to a seat that had been reserved for the most honored guests. As they walked, the general spoke quietly to Samuel, his voice filled with the kind of respect that should have been shown from the very beginning. Sergeant Washington, I want you to know that what happened here today will not be forgotten, the general said. This kind of treatment is unacceptable, especially for someone who has given so much to our country. Samuel nodded but didn't seem angry or bitter about what he had experienced. Instead, there was a sadness in his eyes that spoke to something deeper than just this one incident. General, this isn't the first time something like this has happened to me. Probably won't be the last either. People see what they expect to see, and sometimes what they expect isn't very kind. The general stopped walking for a moment and looked at Samuel with an expression that mixed admiration and sorrow. Here was a man who had faced prejudice and discrimination his entire life, yet he had still served his country with honor and distinction. He had saved lives, earned the highest military honor, and continued to carry himself with dignity even when others failed to recognize his worth. That doesn't make it right, General Hayes said firmly, and it doesn't mean we should accept it or ignore it when it happens. As they reached the front row, Samuel could see the casket that held the remains of his old friend and fellow soldier. General Patterson had lived a full life after that day in Vietnam when Samuel had carried him to safety. He had risen through the ranks, commanded thousands of soldiers, and made decisions that affected the lives of countless people. But in Samuel's mind, he would always be the young lieutenant who had cared about his men and led from the front. The funeral ceremony was about to begin, and people were taking their seats throughout the cemetery. The earlier commotion had delayed things slightly, but now everything was ready to proceed. As Samuel sat down in his place of honor, he felt a mixture of emotions that was hard to describe. He was sad about losing his friend, proud to be recognized, for his service, and hopeful that something good might come from the difficult experience he had just endured. General Hayes took his place at the podium to deliver the main eulogy. He had prepared remarks about General Patterson's distinguished career, his leadership abilities, and his contributions to military strategy and training. But as he looked out at the assembled crowd, he knew he needed to add something that hadn't been planned. "Ladies and gentlemen," the general began, his voice carrying clearly across the cemetery, "we are here today to honor the life and service of General William Patterson, a man who dedicated over 4 decades to serving our nation and protecting our freedom." He spoke about Patterson's early career, his rise through the ranks, and his many accomplishments as a military leader. The assembled crowd listened respectfully as the general painted a picture of a life well lived and service well given. But then General Hayes paused and looked toward the front row where Samuel was sitting. "However, there is a story about General Patterson that many of you may not know, and it's a story that reminds us why we must never judge people based on appearances or assumptions." The crowd stirred slightly, sensing that something important was about to be said. Even those who had witnessed the earlier confrontation weren't sure what was coming next. In November 1968, then Lieutenant Patterson was serving with the 173rd Airborne Brigade in Vietnam. During a mission that turned into an ambush, he was severely wounded and trapped under enemy fire. Without immediate medical attention, he would have died on that battlefield. Samuel felt his heart beating faster as the general continued the story. He rarely talked about that day, and hearing it told to hundreds of people felt both strange and meaningful. "The man who saved Lieutenant Patterson's life is sitting with us today," General Hayes continued, gesturing toward Samuel. "Sergeant Samuel Washington crawled 50 yards through active combat, under constant enemy fire, to reach his wounded officer. He then carried Lieutenant Patterson back to safety, saving his life and earning the Medal of Honor for his extraordinary courage." A murmur went through the crowd as people turned to look at Samuel with new understanding. Some of the same people who had watched him being questioned and doubted now felt the weight of their earlier assumptions. Without Sergeant Washington's heroism that day, we would not be here honoring General Patterson's 4 decades of service, because his career would have ended before it truly began. The thousands of soldiers who served under General Patterson's command, the strategies he developed that saved countless lives, the leadership he provided during some of our nation's most challenging times, none of that would have happened if not for the courage of the man sitting in our front row. General Hayes paused to let his words sink in before continuing. "Earlier today, Sergeant Washington was questioned about his right to be here. He was asked to prove that he belonged among us. Let me be clear. Sergeant Washington doesn't just belong here. He should be honored above all of us. And the fact that anyone would question his presence based on his appearance is a reminder of how far we still have to go as a society." The silence that followed was profound. People who had been part of the crowd watching Samuel's humiliation now felt ashamed of their inaction. The security guard who had threatened to remove Samuel looked like he wanted to disappear. The young military officer who had questioned Samuel's credentials was staring at the ground, his face red with embarrassment. After the ceremony concluded, something unexpected began to happen. People started approaching Samuel, not out of curiosity this time, but out of genuine respect and often with apologies. The first person to reach him was the young military officer who had initially confronted him. "Sir," the officer said, his voice shaking slightly, "I owe you a sincere apology. I made terrible assumptions based on nothing but my own prejudices, and I treated a true American hero with disrespect. I'm ashamed of my behavior, and I hope you can forgive me." Samuel looked at the young man with kind eyes. He could see the genuine remorse in the lesson that had been learned. "Son, we all make mistakes. What matters is that we learn from them and do better next time. You're a good soldier and you'll be a better one because of what happened today." The security guard approached next, looking even more uncomfortable than the officer. "Mr. Washington, I don't know how to apologize for what I did. I was wrong, completely wrong, and I'm sorry." Samuel shook the man's hand and offered the same grace he had shown the officer. "We all have things to learn about treating people with dignity and respect. Today was a learning day for all of us." Over the next hour, dozens of people approached, Samuel with similar apologies and expressions of respect. Many were veterans themselves who realized they had stood by and watched a fellow soldier be mistreated. Others were civilians who recognized that they had witnessed an injustice and done nothing to stop it. But perhaps the most meaningful conversation came from an elderly woman who had been sitting near the back of the ceremony. She walked slowly to where Samuel was standing, using a cane to steady herself. "Mr. Washington," she said, "I'm Helen Patterson, the General's widow. I wanted to thank you personally for what you did for my husband all those years ago. Without you, I wouldn't have had 45 wonderful years of marriage, and my children wouldn't have had their father." Samuel felt tears coming to his eyes as he took the elderly woman's hand. "Ma'am, your husband was a good man and a fine officer. I'm honored that I was able to help him that day. He talked about you often," she continued. "He never forgot what you did for him, and he never stopped being grateful. He would have been horrified by how you were treated today, but he also would have been proud of how you handled yourself, with such dignity." As the afternoon wore on and people began to leave the cemetery, Samuel found himself reflecting on the day's events. It had started with humiliation and assumptions, but it had ended with recognition and respect. More importantly, it had become a teaching moment for everyone who witnessed it. General Hayes approached Samuel one final time before leaving. "Sergeant Washington, I hope you know that what happened today will lead to changes. We're going to make sure that our security personnel and military officers receive better training about treating all veterans with respect, regardless of their appearance." Samuel nodded appreciatively. "That's good, General. But the real change has to come from people's hearts, not just their training. We have to learn to see each other as human beings first, before we see anything else." As Samuel finally prepared to leave Arlington National Cemetery, he looked back at the headstone that now marked his old friend's final resting place. The day had been difficult in ways he hadn't expected, but it had also been meaningful in ways that surprised him. The story of what happened at General Patterson's funeral spread quickly through military communities and beyond. It became a powerful reminder that heroes come in all forms and that dignity and respect should never depend on appearance or assumption. Samuel's grace under pressure, combined with the moral courage of those who finally stood up for what was right, transformed what could have been just another story of prejudice into something much more powerful, a lesson about the importance of looking deeper, listening better, and treating every person with the respect they deserve.